And shiny at number 5, we have Crystal Beast Emerald Tortoise, one of the worst Crystal Beast monsters in the game. Because on its own, Emerald Tortoise doesn't really do anything. It has a standard Crystal Beast effect, which allows you to place it face up in your spell and trap card zone as a continuous spell when it's destroyed as a monster, rather than send it to the graveyard. And its unique effect just allows you to target a monster in the field that's attacked this turn and change it to defense position. Neither of these effects do anything powerful or important for most strategies, to the point where Emerald Tortoise isn't even run in current Crystal Beast decks, as you'd rather play stronger Crystal Beasts like Pegasus and Carbuncle before you even start considering cards like Emerald Tortoise. But even with how bad Emerald Tortoise is in its own deck, it actually saw a fair amount of competitive play this year because of how it worked in tier limits. One of the key strengths of tier limits is being able to mill a ton of cards so that you can take advantage of the graveyard effects, and as a result, they would play a ton of different cards with powerful graveyard effects they could use if they were randomly milled. Fairy Tail Snow gave the deck a strong piece of interaction. Vivid Tail and Fusion Substitute allowed the deck to easily out Mystic Mine, and even the Paleozoics gave you free body after you summon them back to the field. But another great graveyard effect that saw a decent amount of play in tier limits was Rainbow Bridge of Salvation. This graveyard effect lets you banish it in order to add a Crystal Beast monster and any field spell in the game from your deck to your hand. This gave tier limits a ton of options when it milled it. You could use it to grab Peeler Rhino to get your play started, Zombie World if you were facing down Fluendereeze, or even Mystic Mine if you were going second. One of the key issues with Rainbow Bridge of Salvation, however, is that it required that a Crystal Beast monster was in your deck in order to use it. This meant that if you were playing something like Topaz Tiger or Amber Mammoth, drawing that Crystal Beast or even milling it meant that Salvation was pretty much offline forever. However, Emerald Tortoise just so happens to be the perfect card for tier limits to pair with Salvation, and having that card in hand or in the graveyard was even a benefit for the deck because Emerald Tortoise is an Aqua monster. This meant that drawing or milling Emerald Tortoise wasn't a big deal, as if you wanted to use the graveyard effect of your Bridge of Salvation, you could just use the graveyard effect of your tier limit monsters to shuffle back Emerald Tortoise in order to grab tier limit's Kit Kalos, a fusion monster whose required materials are any tier limit monster plus any Aqua type monster. So Bridge of Salvation not only gave you any field spell you wanted, it also gave you a free card that you can actually use as a fusion material. With Trevi Karma soon to be released, however, it's unlikely that tier limits will end up playing Rainbow Bridge again, since Trevi Karma is just Rainbow Bridge for decks in the Visa Starfrost lore that just has built-in more utility, especially since you don't need to play a card that doesn't really do anything in your main deck for it. But for the time it was around in tier limit decks, Rainbow Bridge managed to make one of the worst Crystal Beast monsters in the game an absolute boon to the now tier 0 archetype. Stretching the number 4 spot is number 29, Mannequin Cat, a rank 2 monster that's managed to see a ton of competitive play this year because of Sprite, and has allowed for a ton of old and strange cards to shut down other meta strategies. Mannequin Cat has 2 effects. The first allows you to target a monster in your opponent's graveyard and special summon it to their side of the field. Now normally this would be a pretty bad effect, but it also feeds into Mannequin Cat's second effect, which you can trigger whenever a monster is special summoned to your opponent's side of the field. And whenever it's activated, you can target any monster your opponent controls, and then special summon a monster from your hand, deck, or graveyard with the same type or attribute as that monster targeted. Essentially, this second effect is an E-tally for any monster in the game, but only if your opponent controls a monster with the same type or attribute as the monster you want to summon. And so, Sprite plays different Mannequin Cat targets to side into depending on the matchup. If your opponent is playing tier limits, you can either play the End of Anubis, since most tier monsters are dark, or Tetsu Unrat Numen, since most tier monsters are aqua. Both of these cards act as floodgates, which can stop tiers from playing entirely if they're summoned at the right time, since End of Anubis is basically Abyss Dweller, and Numen stops any monster with over 1800 attack from being summoned. But if you happen to be in a Sprite mirror match, you might instead choose to summon Thunder King Ryo, since all the Sprite monsters are Thunder monsters. This prevents Sprite from being able to use the search effects of Sprite Blue and Sprite Jet, and could even be used to stop Link or XC summons of key boss monsters with its second effect. And even when against decks that don't special summon at all, Mannequin Cat still has a ton of utility. Against Fluendereeze, for example, it may appear like Mannequin Cat can't really do anything, but it's actually a really important tool for Sprite to be able to play through an opponent's Dimension Shifter. Because if your opponent activates Dimension Shifter, you can then XC summon Mannequin Cat and use Mannequin Cat's first effect to summon that shifter from your opponent's graveyard to their side of the field. This then allows you to trigger the second effect of Mannequin Cat to summon out Chaos Hunter from your deck, yet another floodgate which prevents your opponent from banishing any cards at all, restricting the Fluendereeze engine and preventing some of their strongest cards from being used at all. Overall, Mannequin Cat is actually an absurdly strong card that's only managed to begin seeing play again because of how easily Sprite can access it. But now it's seen play, Mannequin Cat has allowed for a whole host of strange and quirky monsters that otherwise wouldn't have seen the light of day to not only see play, but be integral for winning games. And it, alongside its targets, will likely be great tools in Sprite for years to come. Being summoned to this list at number 3 is Ra's Disciple, a piece of the Egyptian god support with one of the most restrictive floodgates in the game. Disciple's first effect is actually incredible, as it allows you to swarm the field up to 2 other copies of itself whenever it's summoned, And if that's where the effect ended, this card would have actually been a really stellar way of generating free materials for Link or XC summoning. But it's Disciple's other effect which makes this card so terrible, as while you control it, you cannot special summon any other monsters at all, except by the effect of Ra's Disciple, locking it out of your extra deck and main deck monsters. And you can't even tribute it over for something like a Bestial, as Disciple can't be tributed except for the tribute summon of one of the Egyptian god cards. Essentially, if you summoned out Ra's Disciple to your side of the field, you're locking yourself out of doing anything else apart from summoning an Egyptian god, which is why Ra's Disciple never really saw too much play outside of Egyptian god decks, despite the advantage its first effect could generate. But this year, Ra's Disciple has actually seen a ton of use in a deck that doesn't play any Egyptian gods at all, specifically because of its Floodgate effect. You see, branded decks would actually use Ra's Disciple as a fusion material when fusing for Albion the Branded Dragon, since Ra's Disciple is a light monster. So you would use the effect of Aluber to search for Branded Fusion from your deck, then use Branded Fusion to summon Albion with Ra's Disciple in Fallen of Albaz. Then you would use the effect of Albion to fusion summon Lubellion by banishing Albaz from your graveyard and Aluber from your field, and with the effect of Lubellion, you would shuffle back Albion and Albaz to summon out Mirajade the Iceblade Dragon. After that, you would use the effect of Mirajade to banish itself and another copy of Albion into graveyard. Then, during your end phase, Albion can set Branded Expulsion to your field. Then, during your opponent's turn, with the effect of Expulsion, you can tribute your on-field Albion to target your banished Aluber and Ra's Disciple in your graveyard, and summon out Aluber to your field in defense position, while giving Ra's Disciple to your opponent. This locks most decks out of play in the game entirely. They can't link off Ra's Disciple because of its Floodgate, and they can't crash it if you summon it to their field in defense position because you can't change the battle position of a monster during the turn it's summoned, leaving normal summoning as the only option most decks have. This is basically an FTK for most decks. But others, like Floowandereeze, can actually function incredibly well under Ra's Disciple since the entire deck is based around normal summoning. And in Master Duel for a while, this was actually a pretty prominent issue as Floowandereeze was a really popular deck prior to the statue ban, which made Ra's Disciple a risky gambit, as it either won you the game on the spot or lost hard to Floowandereeze. So to counter that, branded decks would actually pivot to yet another terrible card that they could give to their opponent to floodgate them out of the game. Yugioh, the Supreme Magical Force, has a really similar effect to Ra's Disciple, and can be summoned to your opponent's field with a combo very similar to the one to bring out Ra's Disciple. But the key difference is that Yugioh stops all summons. So in Master Duel, it was actually the go-to option for Expulsion over Ra's Disciple, because it also stopped Floowandereeze from playing the game. Both Yugioh and Disciple are undoubtedly terrible cards, but even despite how weak they can be, Branded Expulsion has managed to turn them into terrifying threats that can be used to lock your opponent out of the game entirely with self-restrictive floodgates. Winding up to number 2 is Wind-Up Kitten, an often forgotten member of the Wind-Up archetype that saw a spike in play this year because of its level and powerful removal effect. And this effect is very simple but deceptively strong, as it lets you target a monster your opponent controls and return it to the hand. But you can only use this effect of Wind-Up Kitten once per copy on the field. This effect represents a free way to remove an opponent's monster from the field. This is a really strong effect, but one that decks haven't been able to take advantage of until now because of how hard Wind-Up Kitten was to access. But because Wind-Up Kitten is level 2, it actually became a really valuable asset for Runic Sprite. Runic Sprite is a great deck, but it has its own fair share of weaknesses. The Runic cards force you to skip your next battle phase, so it was actually fairly difficult to remove your opponent's threats and boss monsters from the field during your turn. The deck definitely has its fair share of options, like Onibimaru and Flashing Fire, but losing the battle phase meant that losing out on one of your best ways to clear your opponent's field, and if you use Flashing Fire on a tier limit monster, you just trigger its graveyard effect. And that's where Wind-Up Kitten came in. Because Wind-Up Kitten is level 2, it can be summoned off a Gigantic Sprite, and then you can use the effect of Kitten to bounce one of your opponent's monsters to the hand, making it a really nice way to clear your opponent's monsters and was particularly effective against tier limits since it didn't trigger their graveyard effect since they'd be bounced back to the extra deck. But that's not all, because you can also link off Wind-Up Kitten and Gigantic to link summon Sprite Elf, and then use the effect of Elf to bring back Wind-Up Kitten from the graveyard. And because Kitten is treated as a different card when you summon it back from the graveyard, you can use this effect again to bounce yet another monster your opponent controls, giving you free removal every turn so long as you resummon out Kitten with Elf. Nowadays, Kitten is very rarely played, even in Sprite, but for the brief period that it did see play, it was an incredibly effective tool for clearing away your opponent's board, especially in a deck that rarely ever had access to its battle phase. But even for as strong as Kitten was, there is one more card that shined even brighter than it in 2022. Swimming into the number 1 spot on this list is King of the Swamp, another really old card that was released in 2004 and has only now just managed to really start seeing a ton of play in the metagame 18 years later. Like most older cards, King of the Swamp's effects are very simple. Its main effect allows you to discard it from your hand in order to add a copy of Polymerization from your deck to your hand. And King of the Swamp's other effect allows it to be substituted as material for any fusion material that's specifically listed on a fusion monster, as long as the other materials used to fusion summon that monster are correct. Every aspect of King of the Swamp has allowed for Tearlaments to take advantage of the card more so than any other card on this list. The fact that it can add polymerization for free has allowed Tearlaments access to one of the strongest generic fusion monsters in the game, Guardian Chimera, which gives them an extra option to clear away an opponent's field while also drawing cards for free. But that's not all, because King of the Swamp also just so happens to be an Aqua type monster. So when you discard it to the graveyard to search Poly, you've set up your graveyard already, so that when you send a Tearlament monster to the graveyard, you can use its effect to fuse it and King of the Swamp into Kid Kalos and combo from there. By far, the most appealing aspect of King of the Swamp for Tearlaments is its substitution effect, which allows them easy access to their own fusion boss monster, as well as the fusion boss monsters of other decks. With the strongest example so far being how the deck can access Grapha, Dragon Overlord of the Dark World, the latest Dark World boss monster. You see, Grapha's effect is actually incredible for Tearlaments, as it changes the effect of your opponent's monster or normal spell or trap card to force the controller of Grapha to discard a card instead. And if you discard a Tearlament, you're sent it to the graveyard by a card effect, allowing you to use its effect to fusion summon and combo off on your opponent's turn after negating one of their combo pieces. One of the key issues with Grapha, however, is that it requires the original Grapha in order to summon, a card which is great for Dark Worlds but not something you'd want to run in Tearlaments. King of the Swamp remedies this issue, as now instead of having to play a brick that does nothing for your deck in order to access new Grapha, you can instead use King of the Swamp to act as the original Grapha for a fusion summon. And because Fusion Grapha's other materials is a dark monster, which most of the Tearlaments are, the card becomes laughably easy to go into. But King of the Swamp's utility doesn't even stop there. In the OCG, Tearlaments have been around for a lot longer than the TCG and have had a recent ban list which saw Tearlament Kid Kalos, one of the deck's biggest combo pieces, completely banned, as well as a ton of limits to the other tier cards. And you would think this would make Tearlaments unplayable, since banning Kid Kalos meant they can no longer access one of their best endboard pieces, Tearlaments Rukalos, since one of its fusion materials is Kid Kalos. However, King of the Swamp has allowed for Rukalos to still be summoned in the OCG, since Rukalos just so happens to specifically mention Kid Kalos, allowing you to fuse any Tearlament name with King of the Swamp to access Rukalos easily. So even with all of the hate it's received in the Forbidden Limited list, Tearlaments is still around in the OCG, partly due to how it specifically synergizes with King of the Swamp. A ton of strange and old cards have seen competitive play this year, but none are as unique or as strong as King of the Swamp. And for as long as Tearlaments is relevant to the deck, King of the Swamp is going to be a great card for them to fall back on, especially if the deck receives the same kind of treatment in the TCG as it did in the OCG. But even as it stands right now, it's the strongest but strangest card of 2022. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other unique cards that saw play in 2022 that we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.